Great. Good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Sudeep, and welcome you all to the first real panel discussion that we have after the kickoff, right? So the topic of today's session is how do we improve health outcomes by using RWE and to engage patients, right? And uh, my name is Sudeep. I'm the co-founder of HealthArc, work very closely with Gaurav. And, basically the reason, the focus that we have today on this topic is, a lot of data that we use in RWE is data that we gather from patients, right? And sometimes patients ask this question saying that, what's in it for us? So that's what we'll be focusing on, right? So we'll focus on how RWE is revolutionizing the way we engage with patients and improve their care. We'll also explore what the latest advancements in RWE are and how these advancements are helping us understand patient needs a lot better. It's my honor to introduce your moderator for this session, Matt Veatch. Matt is the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Navidence. He also serves as a consultant in the healthcare real-world data and evidence ecosystem. He has over 25 years of experience in life sciences R&D. There's a lot of work in shaping new research models and paradigms. Matt has previously served as the managing director of RevSite Consulting and held key leadership roles at Seniors Health and Quintiles. Additionally, Matt is a founding board member of Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, DTRA, which was launched in 2020 and has grown remarkably quickly to over 90 life sciences technology and government regulator members. Before I hand over to Matt, I'd also like to welcome our rest of our co-panelists as well as the participants. Would love for this to be an engaging conversation. So all those who are joining us, feel free to leave a bunch of comments. I'm sure the panel will be really excited to answer a lot of those questions. So Matt, all yours. Welcome to the conference.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandeep. Wonderful to be moderating this exciting panel and really kicking off the discussion today. This is a Lens on the Patient panel session. We, as you will see, have a very experienced expert panel for you, and we'll dive right into the discussion here in just a minute about innovative strategies and approaches for real-world data serving RWE. We'll discuss patient recruitment and retention, specifically focusing on the undetected patient, enhancing RWE study quality, advancing health equity, RWE technical innovations, and improving patient care as a critical aspect of the healthcare journey. So with that, very quickly, we'll turn to the panel. I will quickly introduce the members and ask each of them to share a bit more on their background. And in the interest of time, I will direct a specific question to each panel member for a response, and then open for further panel comments, and most importantly, the participant questions. So we really want to encourage those. Delighted to have us joined by Nam Nguyen. He is the VP of Solutions, Informatics and Data Science at CureMeta. Dan Hausman, co-founder and the Chief Technical Officer of Graticule. Irena Brookes-Smith, who is Head of Healthcare Analytics at AstraZeneca. And Abhishek Jha, who is the co-founder and CEO of Elucidata. So with that, we'll kick off again, directing questions to the panel members, and then we'll have input from the rest of the panel, and we'll finally turn to questions from the audience. So first question, Nam, I'll start with you.
Sure.
What is the role of RWE in enhancing patient care and improving health outcomes?
Well, I would say real-world evidence has sort of evolved significantly over the past few decades. I think the welcome note, how many? It said 2 decades of real-world evidence in our industry, probably a little more than that. But what I can do is I can sort of touch on some of the traditional uses of RWE, and then go into some of the newer, more interesting and advanced and novel approaches that we're seeing today. So I would say for RWE, there's been a lot of work in the past on post-market surveillance and pharmacovigilance. This is the use of RWE to sort of monitor the safety and efficacy of drugs after they've been approved and introduced to the market. What we do here is we look at electronic health records, claims, et cetera, to see if there are any long-term side effects or identify, something rare in terms of side effects that might not have been captured during the traditional randomized clinical trials. Other things that have been done with RWE, for instance, drug utilization studies. Here, RWE helps us evaluate how medications are being used in routine clinical practice, including patterns of prescribing, patient adherence, et cetera. Other types of work on comparative effectiveness, cost effectiveness analysis, looking at insights into the economic value of treatments, et cetera. And of course, a lot of work in health policy and reimbursement decisions. Payers and policymakers using the wealth of data that they've been collecting in electronic health records and claims, et cetera, and informing, how they cover healthcare, do reimbursement decisions, et cetera. And, especially look into high cost treatments. Currently, what CareMeta has been sort of supplying in terms of data for their clients in real world data has really shifted. There's been a lot of work in precision medicine. So, precision medicine being, the application and tailoring of treatments in healthcare and decisions to individual characteristics of each patient, particularly focused on their genetic or environmental or lifestyle factors. The goal of precision medicine is sort of to move away from the traditional one-size-fits-all model of treatment, in which patients with the same disease are given the same treatment, regardless of their individual differences. So, one use case that we see continually coming up in terms of data needs in our spaces, around, say, non-small cell lung cancer. Once again, traditionally, these are treated with sort of this one-size-fits-all approach, where patients with a similar type of cancer receive the same treatment. However, with advances in genomics and precision medicine, treatments can now be tailored to the unique molecular characteristics of a patient tumor. So RWE plays a pivotal role in this shift, especially in the field of immunotherapy, which harnesses the body's immune system to fight cancer. So, we work with healthcare providers and figure out ways to find and identify the data that's necessary to, deliver specific treatments for these patients.
Great insights, Nam. Really, just in terms of the work that you sort of do every day, I think that RWE is contingent on having high quality real world data. And what are some of your thoughts around ensuring that the real world data, there aren't necessarily frameworks or quality metrics per se, but there are certainly metrics that apply to the fit for purpose or the use of the data. What are some of those considerations in your mind for actually ensuring that you have the data that you need for the RWE use case?
That's a great question. I think one of the most difficult things within real world evidence is actually identifying where the data is. So, I think everyone here has had the same issue of having a great idea for a research project, and realizing that the data for that particular project is locked up somewhere. So I would say the majority of the work that at least we do at CareMeta is this curation bit, and really searching and working with healthcare providers to identify where is the data. Anecdotally, I would say one of the interesting things that we've done in the past was, what was it? There was a client that wanted EKG data, right? And it seems like simple enough. Let's just go down, go down to your local hospital and let's ask them, hey, can we get some EKG data? And what we had found was the specific EKG data that they were interested in, which I believe was the harness, the EKG harness data, was actually not in the EHR system. It wasn't in a subsequent software system, but instead it was actually locked up in the device itself. The challenges of trying to get that data out included, contracting with that medical device company to give us the right to, get the data out of that machine. One, identifying how to get that data out of the machine. It wasn't a simple USB plug or anything like that. I think there was a proprietary harness that had to be attached to the machine, et cetera. And at the end of the day, I think we didn't even get the data out, but we know where it was. It's these challenges that I think is, part of our industry right now, and crucial to having studies work is, one, identifying where that data is, figuring out how to get the data out, and then cleaning the data and making it usable for the researcher, which includes linking that data to a patient, which I'm sure other folks have had challenges as well, and then curating and making sure that data can be linked with other modalities so that the research can happen.
So you're saying it's not just show up at the local hospital and say, hey, I need some data. There's quite a process involved in actually even determining where the data is within the health system, and then of course the appropriate steps to obtain that data. And something that I know about your organization, Nam, is that governance and data governance and the relationship is a critical consideration for accessing the real world data. Can you touch on that for just a moment? And then I'll turn to other panel members for their thoughts, specifically around enhancing patient care and improving health outcomes with real world data that's accelerating RWE.
Yeah, definitely. I think, depending on where you are in terms of, what government or what regulations, your data is under, it's really important to, one, build the relationships with the data providers so that you are trusted in many ways. You don't want to just come in and demand data. Obviously, that's not going to work. And I think everyone's probably been in that situation where, you come in thinking that, oh, I'm going to cure cancer. And, and just because I say that, a provider is going to be able to, or want to come and just give you data freely. Instead, really building a collaborative, working relationship with data providers, being healthcare providers, hospitals, et cetera, and making sure that they are in tune with what you are trying to do and what you're trying to deliver in terms of that data is crucial and important.
Perfect, thanks. Comments or thoughts from the other panelists? Well, Nam, another consideration is just with regard to not only the relationships that it takes to have access to the data, but I am curious your thoughts around bringing the right data science team and having the right resources, because it isn't just merely showing up, going through the governance process of obtaining the data. You obviously have to have the right team in place. As VP Solutions, Informatics, and Data Science, thoughts about the team that's actually necessary to extract these insights from the real world data?
Yeah, that's really interesting point. I think for my team, I've always found that marrying the sort of discipline of medical informatics and data science together in a single team is very important. And the reason is, at least in terms of resourcing, I would say it's very, very difficult to find a medical informaticist that's a great data scientist, or a data scientist that's a great medical informaticist. And if you do find one that's a diamond in the rough, you should keep them and throw a lot of money at them so that they never leave your company. But the reality is, you've got these great experts of understanding how the data is being put into the electronic record system or wherever it's being put into. You've got specialists that obviously are part of the clinical teams, and have decided to transition to some more of like data and things like that. And you've got this medical informatics discipline of sort of understanding and interpreting why the data looks the way it is. And you need these people to sort of clean and, for lack of a better word, munge the data into a form that can be used for research. Now that's one entire discipline that I think deserves its own hour-long conversation. But on the other side, there's these data scientists that they just want to see what trends are happening in any data, right? And they're using the latest and greatest tools, AI, ML, and then some of the ancient tools like just basic statistics. And if you don't have a fundamental grasp of that, then you really don't have a great interpretation on top of the data set you have. But really, it's marrying those two and making sure that you have built resources that have good skills on both sides, and then putting them together as a team and figuring out ways for them to work together is how I see a great data science medical informatics team functioning.
Excellent. Great insights. Well, we'll turn to the next question here in just a moment, but are there any additional comments from the panel for Dan?
One comment, actually, I completely agree that finding people who understand the data as well as having the technical skills to analyze the data is really difficult. And I think another discipline that we sometimes forget to include is epidemiology. Obviously, people don't have, our staff and the new data scientists, they don't need to be epidemiologists, but understanding basic concepts of study design, of what are the sources of biases, what is confounding with the data, etc. Those are things that shouldn't be underestimated, especially if we think about kind of novel methods. I think understanding the basics is fundamental to be able to utilize the data.
Great point. Yeah, critically important. Well, thanks so much, Dan. We'll circle back with additional questions towards the end with audience members. So Dan, I'd like to turn to you and we'll tackle question number 2 together. So how does RWE help in identifying undetected patients and tailoring interventions to their needs?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Maybe I'll start by introducing myself. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder at Graticule. And we work across data sources, across life sciences companies, some med device, some pharma. And this is one of my favorite problems because it's an area where we have 3 parties all aligned, which is, life sciences company wants their product to be used effectively. The health system providers want their patients to get the best possible care. And the patients themselves are the ones who are waiting for whichever intervention could be available to them, but they're more often than not blocked by some issue of translation and evidence and something stopping what they could benefit from getting to them. And the 2 big use cases we see are either clinical trial recruitment, where there's some experimental medicine, and the patient community is really not that well understood in the first place, or the complexity of the trial criteria are in the way, or something I'll roughly consider like patient identification, clinical decision support, or even just activation of providers to know that a therapy is the right therapy for those patients. Because we're living in a system that's very complex, where there's multiple paths any patient could take, and if they take the wrong turn, they didn't get to a clinician who can diagnose the problem. So, what you can do with real-world evidence is you start at the end point, which is, oh, I want to find this patient for this trial. Oh, I want to have this patient on the therapy, and look backwards to see, well, what's really happening. So you're not going to be able to fix a system you don't understand or improve a system you don't understand. And so we look for the data sources that can provide insight into that area. And that's why I love working in context where we're not bounded by a single data source. And so the big piece, we can look at is there a gap in follow-up or some kind of gap in care? Like, does a patient end up seeing a cardiologist but not an interventional cardiologist? And is the reason why they're not getting referred some kind of referral problem that those aren't the people who think about a personalized problem, like they have a high risk condition. Or it could be that there's a very hard to diagnose disease. The tools just aren't great for finding the patient with that disease. A couple examples we were working on a few years back were ATTR, which is a rare cardiology disease, but a lot of the symptoms that appear before you get into problematic cardiac symptoms are things like bilateral carpal tunnel syndrome. And so by having these tools where you can look back into the patients that actually have been diagnosed, you can see what were the leading indicators. So RWD is very good as a potential case for building new biomarkers or digital biomarkers that can direct what sorts of paths someone's going to go through in their diagnostic journey. And in the case of NASH, for example, client we're working with one to find patients who could end up on studies. Well, NASH is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, right? People who have problems with their liver who aren't alcohol drinkers. And the problem you run into is you have to biopsy a patient to know if they have NASH. And you can't biopsy 10,000 people. And so you need to have effective data to be able to predict who, when you biopsy them, is going to have NASH. And in the case of a clinical trial, who's going to qualify for the trial beforehand. And almost all the cases we've seen where we're trying to get into using real world data to improve patient ID, the initial assumption that there's some magic wand you can put in front of the current data and pick the patients out because you have the right algorithm is proven wrong. It's almost always a workflow issue and a statistics issue of figuring out who are the best ones to target, and can you come up with a workflow process that's going to be effective to be able to put in some new intervention. And so the real world data gives you that insight into where can you put that intervention. I think there's also big challenges with uncoded problems. There's a lot of diseases that drugs are being designed to treat or even already treat where the actual disease it treats doesn't have a code. And so being able to use real world data to sort of find out what in the record at least would give you a 90% chance of classifying that patient, even if you're not at 100%, would get there. And so we do a lot of work where you use real world data, especially when you're getting above and beyond the coded information, which is where all of us, I think, we enjoy it, but it's also incredibly challenging, as others will mention, to define that data and to be able to make it accessible. But when you do, you can say, well, here is the actual documentation of how people are documenting the patients that fit this criteria. And oftentimes that may even sit outside of the traditional medical record. It might be radiomics, but if it is, it's probably not just radiomics. So we were working, in a case with a client who wanted to, and has a product to classify patients who would benefit from PD-L1 therapy who have lung cancer, because people with lung cancer only have so much time to get their treatments, and a whole bunch of patients will not respond. And so if we have the real world data in hand, we can design systems, and in that case they were a diagnostics provider, to be able to pick out the patients who will respond and ultimately get them on the therapy and not waste resources on therapies that won't work, and maybe put those patients who won't respond on a next generation therapy or a combination. So there's a lot of these things we can do to build out much better pathways, but I'll skip quickly over to the fact that none of that matters unless you can get it to the point of care. It's all book research, it's all papers, it's all graphs that show this might work. And what's, I think, exciting about what we can do these days, because a lot has happened, CureMeta is very integrated into health systems. We work with health systems directly, as well as other groups that are really integrated at the point of care, is getting to that translation point. And by being able to work at the point of care, we can start doing things which now are maybe they're not real world data anymore, right? We're using the real world data as a way to accelerate the journey to be able to basically change practice at scale, where we're trying to implement utilities that are based on the real world data. Maybe even we built them, like we built a dashboard to identify the patients we're missing, but we didn't do it with real patients. We can give that dashboard back to providers who can find those patients, who can be able to identify them. And, I'll say one of the lessons learned is we got to keep it really simple. Right? If we make very sophisticated tools, which we're capable with Gen AI and all sorts of stuff, if it can't be adopted at the point of care, those patient ID tools are not going anywhere. And the point of care tools can be quite simple. It's an alert that pops up in Epic, or it's a message that's written as a doctor's note referred to another doctor. So I think that sort of the next big thing in terms of getting to this, how do we personalize patient care? How do we get to patient identification? Is how do we translate it? And you go back to real world data, and again, it can inform us a lot about that, right? It can tell us, the problem is this subcategory of providers who really should be caring for these patients this way. Maybe it's a specialty, maybe it's got a certain job title, maybe it's the nurse. They're good at it, but they need to be activated. And so it can allow the life sciences company to position the folks who are engaging with the health system to be a lot more productive. And maybe it's very simple stuff, like simple being what's been done for years from commercial organizations, which is just identify the providers to detail, right? You have an MSL and they talk to provider, to more complicated things like actually implement a full system that's free to the provider with all the logic encoded to be able to find the patient. So, in short, I think the great thing about today's RWE is we're much more connected to the point of care. We're nowhere near as connected as we should be to make it translate for patient ID. Like, we got to do a million things to get there because it takes forever to get these projects done. Workflow is king, right? The provider's workflow or the patient's own workflow of how they go about their finding a solution is the only thing that really matters in the end. And the technology is getting great. We have FHIR, we have new regulations that allow us to get in and out of these systems to make them more open. We have Gen AI, we have all these great tools, but we got to apply them somewhat intelligently if we want to have an impact.
Oh, great insights, Dan. And just to have a little bit of fun with the question for a moment, we talk about undetected patients, and it seems to me that there's also application of real world data for evidence for undiagnosed diseases. That is, we've got the patients, but there are diseases that don't necessarily have an ICD-10 diagnosis code as of yet, but that there would be application for that. Any thoughts about that? Have you engaged in any sort of undetected or rare or orphan disease work previously?
Yeah, I think we get these questions, especially for ones that are these genetic diseases, where the first intervention is going to be, should we run this genetic test, right? Because the genetic test may come up with, oh, they really have this disease. I will say we're a bit biased that we end up working on undiagnosed diseases where there's a treatment that's coming up. And so we're starting to see these very rare treatments that are coming from the genetic therapies. So the ability to actually use gene therapy to change a patient's genome to fix a problem. And they're very interested in, can we find the patients early enough? And some have asked, can we get them between birth and right? So the time they're looking for an undiagnosed disease is very short, because if developmentally, when you intervene with the gene therapy, is a matter of life and death, is a matter of an entire lifetime of impact. They want to know, can you build a model that can help highlight these patients out of the whole population? There are projects coming out of academia, like the Undiagnosed Disease Network, who solely focus on this problem. And they're looking at, ones that probably don't have a therapy as much, because the ones that have a therapy, there's a lot of financial incentive behind improving this. The challenge we face is back to that problem of, how do you distribute such a solution? So if we're trying to distribute a solution for obesity for GLP-1 drugs, that's 30% of the population. We can do anything we want, right? It's going to benefit millions of people. Getting the attention inside of a health system for the 4 people they haven't seen before, and then trying to do it at 1,000 different sites, that's where we've run into the biggest problems for this question of undiagnosed disease. And to be honest, I don't know if we have a good solution for that right now. Like, it's going to take some very compassionate administrators at health systems to allow us to put systems in place that would let the tools we could put in have an impact, or we have to move completely outside of the health systems. AbbVie's actually done some of this work. I was talking to one of the folks in their group, and for some of these undiagnosed diseases or very rare diseases, they just go to, they go to Facebook, right? They move outside of the health system to let the patients do some work on their own, because they realize at least these social media platforms scale really well. And we're getting into these new questions, and I know there's tools like Seekster, although we have some tools as well to pull data out of medical records where the patient thinks they have something, they can go grab that data themselves from the health system. I wouldn't necessarily say we'll call this RWE, but it's definitely a close cousin of letting a patient get their own medical record and then using what we've looked at in a big bulk medical record situation to do things.
Well, something that's impressed me about Graticule is the ability to get the data, to identify the optimal source health system, to build the relationships, to broker and foster the engagement and directly facilitate that. How broad does that need to be, Dan? Is it enough to go to one or two centers if you're trying to capture RWE, or to really focus on the real world aspect of that? Is there a magic number of the centers that you need to obtain data from?
I wouldn't say we think about it that way, because what we end up is with that well-known aphorism, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And it means that if we want to do something that's going to pilot and gain a lot of knowledge quickly, working with just one site could be fine. Maybe it's a big site, maybe it's an extremely collaborative site. But if we want to then answer, the question, like, does this scale, or is this actually real across a whole population? Then we have to look into, should we work with a large RWD provider that's giving us aggregate data that may not give us all the access to that site, but gives us enough data that it's fit for purpose to power the statistics. Irena's got it on the money, right? Like, we can't make a claim unless we have the right epidemiology behind it. And if the source we're picking doesn't have enough power, it's not fit for purpose. And when we make a study and put it out, it's underpowered, right? So we're going to ask the question, what's going to be the right math to get the power we need to be able to power the epidemiology, or power even just the sufficient statistics with error bars to say, well, like, whatever we're going to do is workable. But I like the model of starting small and really closely, ideally with clinicians. For us to do the work we're trying to do on patient ID, it's almost foolish to work in a vacuum just with the data. Like, if we haven't talked to a real clinician who's treating these patients while looking at their data, we're lost. We're making things up. We're hallucinating all day, just like the GPT tools do, right? Because we think we saw something that they go, oh, that's just an artifact. I think we had a tool that found that, a lot of the patients we were looking for were given Pneumovax, and they were like, yeah, all people over 50 get Pneumovax. There's a problem with your algorithm. The computer's really good at picking up people over 50. There's nothing. Right? That's a simple one, but I'm just saying, like,
that's a good one.
Get it all the time, which is we got it wrong looking at the RWD, and we needed to get put in check by someone who treats real patients.
Yeah. No, the human in the loop is critically important in interpreting the available data for evidence. That's a great point. Well, any additional comments from the panel? And if not, we will move on. But Dan, thanks for your insights. I'm sure we're going to come back to you with some questions here in just a moment. But with that, Irena, question number 3, and maybe you could start by sharing just a bit of your background at AstraZeneca, and then we'll target the question, what is the role of RWE in informing clinical research? That is, how RWE is better used to understand unmet medical needs, the burden of disease, and how those insights inform development plans and strategy.
Thank you, Matt. And just a little bit of background, I actually started working in the National Health Service. So I started my career working in public health and in a very large hospital trust in England. At the time, we didn't call it real world data. It was just called data on the other side. And my first exposure to real world data was actually with Dan on a project we did together, as I was trying to understand, how it is used in pharma. But coming from the kind of the National Health Service and coming from like that provider side, I always thought that, the grass was always greener on the pharma side, that, there is so much money being spent in research. I mean, bringing a new drug to market is like, I don't know, what is the latest estimate now, $1 billion, $1.5 billion, depending which kind of publications you trust, but it takes 15 years. And if you think about kind of using real world data in pharma, it has been traditionally used in that kind of post-marketing phase. So once you get approval by FDA, then you need to understand what's happening and what's the effectiveness of drug in order to get kind of payers and other stakeholders on board. But we are the only industry that we're developing something that are given to patients without actually understanding the patient. So when I started working in pharma, the way we design a clinical trial is we go and ask 5 KOLs and tell them how many patients we have with this disease and how they are treated. Now, no disrespect, because these are, key opinion leaders, but they maybe haven't seen a patient in, the past 10 years because they are more interested in the research side. They don't see the patient that lives in rural America that might have multiple comorbidities, that might be on Medicare, etc. So trying to understand who the patient population is really important to then design medicines that are going to treat those patients. So when I started working in pharma, it was kind of, you sometimes design, and some of the things that Dan was mentioning, you design a clinical trial and your inclusion and exclusion criteria are so stringent that you're not actually able to recruit. And moreover, when the trial is ended, your medicine is going to be available in a very small patient population because you don't know how that medicine can work on a broader patient population. It can work on people who have comorbidities, on patients, you exclude. So some of the studies that I was seeing is, for example, you exclude patients with renal disease from some of the heart failure studies. Renal disease is 30% of your population. So trying to think about kind of patients in the very early stages, I think it's really, really important, as well as understanding what are the treatment pathways, what is the unmet medical need, and how they influence the way we design a medicine and how they influence our target patient population. Some of the work we're doing currently at AstraZeneca is not only we're supporting clinical development, so kind of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, we're actually working with our colleagues in discovery to try and understand a lot earlier what that population looks like. They have amazing knowledge about kind of genomics and biomarkers, etc. But translating that into the clinical practice, I think that's where real-world data can help. I agree it's not a magic bullet, and but I do think that it's something that is going to bring us much closer to ensuring that we close that gap between clinical research and clinical practice. And I think that's where the cost of bringing new medicine to patients and the time of bringing new medicines to patients, it's going to be much smaller because we would be able not only to select the right patient population,
Well, we seem to have a little audio issue, video issue there. Hopefully Irena will be back in just a moment. Just in the interest of time, we'll circle back to Irena when she can rejoin. And Abhishek, not to put you on the spot, but maybe we'll move to question 4 and kind of circle back to finish out the commentary with Irena here in just a moment. I would love to learn a little bit more about your role. Obviously, you're the CEO of Elucidata, but learning a little bit more about the company, I think, would be helpful for stage setting. And then we'll turn to question number 4. What are some examples of challenges in RWE and the technology-driven innovations that have improved patient care and identification for RWE studies?
Sure, Matt. Thank you. Again, glad to be part of this panel. before we get into all of this, briefly about myself. I was trained in academia, PhD postdoc at the intersection of data and biology. And then I worked in a small biotech where the team was quite successful. I had a good run. Was there for 6 years, Arduous Pharmaceuticals, and we brought 4 drugs. All 4 of them were first in class to the clinic, and they have been approved. So my that really set me up to start Elucidata. I'm saying all of this partly to just introduce myself, and partly also to highlight that our take on RWEs is quite different. We are on the other end of the spectrum, right? Like where 10 years before a patient sees something, right? Scientists at Pfizer or Genentech or Argius, for that matter, we're working trying to figure out what indication to go after, what is the unmet need, and so on and so forth. And when even if I look back at my days at Argius, RWEs was not so uh, prevalent in early stage. I'm talking about preclinical, early stage clinical, translational, as it is now that we are seeing a lot, right? So that has been quite an exciting development for us, where we are seeing earlier adoption of RW data to identify the right patient segment, to identify a clear unmet need. And both that's true for both therapeutics and diagnostic companies. Um, that's exciting. As a company, what we do is we have built a technology where we can harmonize data, which is we can get into details. Perhaps not the best platform to do that right now, but it's something similar to what Nam was saying and others have identified as curation or getting the data ready, right? Doing that heavy lifting. We have been able to build the technology to do that at scale with very high quality for more than 26 types of data, and that includes molecular data like genomics, transcriptomics, flow cytometry, other assays like IHC and such, and also RWE. And that's the core, IP that we have developed, and we're bringing that to different R&D groups, both in preclinical and clinical setting, both in therapeutics and diagnostics, as we speak. So I hope that gives enough context to folks on the panel. Now diving into the question, Matt, right? Like the challenges, are quite well discussed. In fact, in this panel alone, Nam, I think you touched upon a lot of those themes, and I can speak to that from two perspectives. As a patient myself, and unfortunately, all of us will be patient. I hope not, but that's a quite likely outcome. So when I go to see a doctor, right, at different hospitals, or I buy my medicines, I get my prescription from CVS. I get some diagnostic tests done, right? I have no idea as a patient, like, as to where all the data goes, lives, who owns it. And one of the most surprising things that I find about at least US healthcare, I have no idea who pays how much to who, right? Like that is completely opaque to me, right? Um, Now, as a scientist and as at Elucidata, right, that translates into how fragmented this whole ecosystem is, which is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. And with due respect, like, we have, not touched upon that. We come in when you have collected the data. We don't have any data to begin with. What we do is once the data is collected, it's available somewhere, then we try to make it AI ready, right? That's our starting point. But that's a very clear challenge. Like, we often talk to folks who want to do something, and one of the first things that we get stuck in is that they have no idea where that data is, and they could be, folks from the C-suite of that company, or some earlier in their career scientists or engineers. That's a very pervasive, universal problem that we run into all the time. And then, of course, like once the data is, let's say, someone does the Herculean effort, like Nam shared a very interesting story where it was quite, challenging to get the data off that instrument. But let's say, you solve all those problems, then you run into issues of data quality, how interoperable it is, how do you impute data, like how do you, link it to a particular ontology. And then I think that is what, clearly I'm preaching to the choir here, but that I think is a hugely under-recognized part of the work, right? Like, as a data scientist myself, I would just suck it up and do it, right? I would not even want to go around and say that, hey, I did that, and that's what took a lot of time. I did not know how to get help for that. And I believe that we are making a lot of progress in trying to define that category so that it's as well understood as some other things in the space are. We are in very early days of that journey, but as a community, like, we have to acknowledge that. And um, it's certainly true from our experience that acknowledging that, hey, that's a big risk that you are signing up for before you start and launch an AI initiative, right? Is your data AI ready? And that's surprisingly often overlooked, often understaffed, right? And that brings me to the second part of your question, which is, I think, again, I'll loop in a previous thread that Nam and Irena were talking about data and team, right? And the third component is the technology, which is also evolving quite rapidly, right? Like, now there are very real challenges about how can I access data without moving it from one location to federate it. How can I, harmonize data standards? So there are a lot of, role-based access. Are you using stack of, Snowflake or AWS or both of them? I think that's a very evolving, rapidly evolving space altogether, right? Where vendors like us and others like AWS, Snowflake, Databricks, they're really changing, moving the dial almost on a monthly, quarterly basis. And then on top of that, you have this whole slew of foundation model initiative, which is also very exciting and promising. But it requires a whole lot of expertise to get a handle on that, to evaluate if that is worthwhile, relevant for you or not, right? So these are like some of the challenges, and some commentary that I thought of when I heard this question. I'll stop. I'm happy to expand onto any particular thing, but I'll stop here for any comments or questions.
No, very, very insightful. And I'm curious, Abhishek, just to get your thoughts. The word itself, curation, we've seen an evolution of that just over the last few years, where it's moved from this highly sort of manual data set by data set approach to more of an amalgamation of data. The curation is the bringing together, so to speak, of the requisite data. And how critical is it to try to do that with independent data sets, or to have a central platform that helps facilitate that? And yes, this is a bit of a leading question, because I'm well aware of the poly curation engine at Elucidata, but from your perspective, why is that important to have the platform capability?
Yeah. So I think that's an important question, very, very important question, and relevant, like something that we live and breathe on a daily basis. I'll share like three insights that we have learned on the job, and some of them are quite counterintuitive. So the first one that I'm increasingly convinced of is quite contrarian, but that has served us well, that has served our customers well. And this, so if I paint a picture of what is the conventional, more traditional approach, is to get all the data ready for all the stakeholders for all the time, right? And that's doable, but it requires a huge commitment and investment of time, money, expertise. And to me, and it has not been clear as to what the ROI is. Is it worth it? I mean, sure, you can do it, but is it worth it? That's not quite clear, right? So we have taken a slightly different approach, where we are saying that for a given business question, right? Let's say you want to identify a subsegment of lupus patients, right, who are more likely to respond to a blood clotting prescription, or any such pick a problem, right? Then you build the most relevant multimodal corpus, take that data, and turn that into what we call data product. Again, just like harmonization means a lot of things to different people, data product is yet another such term. But our that relevant corpus of multimodal data and turn that into a data product which is secure, compliant, and AI ready, right? And you rinse and repeat this again and again, right? That, I think, has a much better ROI than taking all the data in the world and getting it ready for all the stakeholders. You just cannot, So that has been a key theme that we have been pushing and bringing to the market, right? Related lesson has been that quality and curation, right? Both of them are very business application uh, centered definition, right? So if I were to curate a data set for you for a first X, it may or may not be relevant at all for a slightly different business question, right? So, like I'll give you an example, right? If you were to identify a particular patient or a corpus, a cohort of patient, versus you want to just get some statistics on like what is the prevalence of the disease, the level of curation is very different. Or let's say you want to feed annotated data sets for your foundation model exercise, right? The burden of quality, the threshold of quality is very different and very much dictated by the purpose as to why you want that, right? A very interesting evidence that we have seen, and I was very intrigued by that for many years now. Like we would see a lot of like we also harmonize a lot of public data. So we would see a lot of companies. Let's say if there are two companies working on IBD, there's only so much data that is out there that is easily available. So most of them would seek the same ones, but every company would want that to be curated a slightly different way, right? And that in some ways confirms this thesis that we have is that you don't need to harmonize all of the data in one particular way for all the stakeholders. It just does not yield good ROI. And the final point that I would like to make is that we are big. We have invested quite heavily in building the technology to harmonize data, but we do not believe today the state of the art SOTA is such that human curators can be eliminated. Right? If you want to promise a particular quality, I think you need to have human curators in the loop, experts in the loop, right? And again, here we have leveraged a lot of lessons that computer vision world has used. Just to give you an example, like self-driving cars, right? They exist because someone has been annotating a lot of images. And if you think about an example where I share an image with you and ask you to annotate lampposts and dogs, it will take you, let's say 10 seconds, right? But if I have those annotations already and I ask you to say yes or no, if this is a lamppost, yes or no, or if this is a dog, yes or no, that's 1 second, right? That's a 10x speed up right there, right? So we translate similar ideas where we give you a clinical note, and we annotate drug, dose, frequency, strength, and 5 other fields, right? And as an expert curator, you say yes or no. That introduces a huge scale up efficiencies for us without compromising the quality. To quality is standard is something that we can meet for our customers that we have promised, right? So quickly to recap, like 3 things, right? One, doing it for all the data that is out there is just not worth it. So we have been pushing this notion of data products. Quality is very application centric. That has to be acknowledged and understood. And finally, like you need human in the loops to deliver on the promise of quality that is needed for a particular application.
I love this, Abhishek, because you're really highlighting the fact that you don't just stray into a real world data for real world evidence situation. There's methodical planning, and the planning and the forethought is a critical component of that.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, I would like to pivot back to Irena. And Irena, sorry for the audio and video issues. I'm glad that you're back. Maybe to just kind of delve back into question number 3 very quickly, maybe I could pose a question and just get your thoughts on that. And then we'll open for some, I've seen quite a few comments come in from the audience. I'd love to address a couple of those. But maybe the question that I'll direct to you is, you were highlighting the fact that RWD is very informative and can help make better, more precise decisions around inclusion exclusion criteria in clinical trials. And I was wondering if you could just comment on some of the key considerations in trying to align inclusion exclusion criteria with the data elements one might find in a real world data set.
Thank you, and apologies, I'm in a very fancy building, but unfortunately internet is today off. So if you think about kind of traditionally, the way we have been looking at inclusion-exclusion criteria, as I said, you ask 10 or 100 or how many physicians they are, and you think about, or you look at previous trials that were run, in diabetes space, for example, and you kind of sometimes use the same inclusion-exclusion criteria for a patient population. If you think about diabetes, in the world of GLP-1s now, things are changing and are changing very rapidly. So trying to understand how that inclusion-exclusion criteria translate in the eligible patient population becomes more and more important. So for example, let's say if I'm running a trial on diabetes, if I exclude patients with heart failure, what does it mean for my patient population? If I exclude patients with CKD, how many patients am I losing? And that's not only for actually the trial being successful, but also thinking further when this drug is available, what is the percentage of patients that are going to benefit from this drug? And how do we get it right? And it's a little bit of an art form as well as science, trying to understand how you get those inclusion-exclusion criteria right, so that you have a successful trial, so you prove efficacy, but also you maximize the number of patients that then can benefit from this drug in the future. So a lot of the work that my team does actually focuses on this idea of how do we use real-world data to design clinical trials that can benefit most patients in the future. Now, data is an issue, and I think some of the discussions around data availability. If you're designing a study on lupus, you need SLEDAI scores. As far as I know, no real-world data will include SLEDAI scores. So if you think, but there are technologies out there that can support, for example, going through patient notes. We haven't had those available in the past. Can we use physicians and patient notes to estimate a SLEDAI score? May not be perfect, but it can be helpful in kind of trying to understand that patient population. If you're looking for other disease areas, you may want to look at kind of, I don't know, in NASH, for example, you have fibroscans. Can you use things like fibroscans to better, without going through a biopsy, to estimate who your patient population can be? So yes, real-world data is not perfect sometimes, and sometimes, what you need is not there. But I think, having data sometimes, or data that is useful is better than no data at all. And there is a famous statistician's quote that says, all models are wrong, some are useful. And I think there are always real-world data that can be useful to inform some of those decisions.
Great thoughts, and very interesting to learn just a little bit more about how you approach the real-world data and its application to inclusion-exclusion criteria. With that, I'd like to quickly pivot to some audience participant questions, if that's okay. We've got a few minutes remaining. The first question is from Banu Pratap Singh. When it comes to identifying undetected patients through RWE, how do you address the challenge of accessing data from diverse and often siloed healthcare systems? Are there any innovative approaches that are particularly effective in bridging these gaps? I know we touched on this a little bit, but maybe Nam, Dan, given your wealth of experience and expertise, maybe you could just highlight some of the considerations for working with very siloed healthcare systems.
Yeah, I can take a quick stab at this one. One of the technologies that comes up quite a bit is using tokenization to be able to link data together. So while we may have trouble, because an RWE source often is cast as what it is, right? So if we're getting a big RWD set from an EHR, we'll generally try and link it to a claims system, open claims or closed claims, ideally closed, if we want to get everything that's happened. And while we may have a heterogeneous picture of the patient, at least now we may have a complete picture of the patient's transactions through payers. And I wouldn't even say it's necessarily innovative, but it's not always available, and you do have to do real work to be able to link data sets if you're doing it for the purposes of identifying the patients in those data sets. If, on the other hand, what you're trying to do is link the data in reality in a health system, now you get into some real barriers from a regulatory standpoint around patient consent, the ability to coordinate within a health system. And again, there's blurry lines between RWD and clinical care when you're talking about patient ID. Now, clinicians can coordinate across health systems, and one thing you'll note when you're looking at health systems that may be in the same geography, especially if it's, for example, they have this in the UK problems, they have this in Canada, they have this in the US. There's the patients who are sort of being seen at a practice that are outpatient primary care, and the patients are being seen in the hospital health system, maybe on very different electronic medical systems. But and ever since a lot of the meaningful use criteria came out and they needed to do population health, have been creating these organizations that are clinically integrated, even though they're not physically integrated at the same source. And so there are groups that have done that through either health information exchange systems to make that happen, or just building big quality control warehouses for the benefit of their patients. Or even maybe, looking forwards to interoperability. If we want to look at a single patient at a time, we can just pull the record from 2 different sites, compare the total record, and make recommendations back to the person at the point of care. So, there are solutions to the broken problem of a fragmented, siloed health system that open up when we're at the point of care, when we're in this treatment payment operation model, which is different from RWE, which is in this research model. And we take very different approaches depending upon, what world we're expecting to be playing in.
Fantastic. Great insight, Dan. I know we've got just a couple of minutes, and I apologize to the audience that we don't have time to address more of these great questions, just really insightful questions. But I would like to take just our final moments and have each of the panelists highlight something from an RWD, RWE perspective. What is it that you're most excited about? And it could be near-term future, it could be long-term future, but what do you see coming in the RWD, RWE arena? Now we'll start with you.
Sure. I think I'm most excited about sort of how data is being shared. I would say 10, 20 years ago, everybody's thinking about either selling their data or, using the data for their own uses, keeping the data sort of really close to their chest. And now having conversations with hospitals and other data collaborators and even IQVIA and things like that, all these data brokers. And the conversation is more about how do we share the data? How do we collaborate? How do we federate? How do we put all this data together so that it benefits everybody? So I'm really excited about that.
I love that. Yeah, as a passionate advocate for the democratization of real world data, I couldn't agree more. I think that's very exciting. Dan, your thoughts?
Well, something new excites me every day because I just love this space. One thing I've really gotten excited about actually is the public resources that have come up during COVID and some of the changes that occurred because of COVID in order to be able to respond rapidly to an emergent problem that everybody had. The capacity to collaborate went through the roof compared to what it was before COVID. And so for an example, one of the ones I'm super excited about is the N3C, which used to be called the National COVID Collaborative. It's now called the National Clinical Collaborative. Is 80 health systems who have pooled their data, who put it in a big pile, absolutely free, and are dying to have life sciences companies go and analyze 30 million patient records. Right? So that's what happens 2 years post-COVID. And I'd love to see what comes up next from that. Because in the spirit of better care for patients, a lot's happened where people realize we can do things that we thought were impossible, mostly because we thought we're doing the best thing for patients by protecting them from having people research their data.
I love that. Yeah,
Right.
the first part of collaboration is cooperation. So I love that. Irena, turning to you.
I think for me, 2 things actually. I think one is around kind of this idea of reimagining how we run clinical trials and kind of the role that real world data can play in that, not only in the looking at inefficiencies, but also in the way we think about the clinical trials, and not only new medicines, but can we each of us, as we go and interact with the healthcare system, can we be part of our own clinical trial in which, effectiveness is assessed? So we have so many kind of treatments that are well established, but we don't go and look about their effectiveness. And I think that there needs to be kind of a change in the way we practice medicine and the way we run clinical trials. I think that is one of the most exciting things that I think it's coming. The other thing, it's more around data, because I am a data geek in the end, but I feel that a lot of real world data is coming from US, part of some European countries, etc. But I think there is, other parts of the world, and the patient population looks different. Disease may manifest different in different populations, etc. So I'm really excited to see some of the more emerging markets develop, electronic health records or more administrative data, and those becoming more available.
Strongly agree. Very exciting times. Abhishek, final comments. We've got just a few seconds left.
Visiting. Two things, like on two very different axes. One, I'm really excited about the adoption of RWE through the entire value chain, right, from early stage discovery to patient care. And the other axis that I'm really excited about, and I hope and I believe we will hear more about in days, months, and years to come, is adoption in wellness, not just disease care, right? I think that will be again quite game-changing, and RWE has a huge.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to the panel. Special thanks to the participants and great audience members. Wonderful questions. Wish we would have had more time to delve into them, but please enjoy the rest of the conference, and we look forward to just further engagement in this very exciting field of real-world data for evidence generation. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Matt. Thanks for moderating.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure.